Hi guys, night still rested over the valley of the Nile. The stars hung above the desert in a sky so clear that every small light seemed close enough to touch. Far from the places where later generations would speak of kings and monuments, ordinary homes sat quietly beside narrow roads of packed earth. The air was cooler than it would be in a few short hours. A soft wind crossed the dark water and moved through the palms. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and then fell silent again. Ancient Egypt was a land of routines. The great river rose and fell. Families woke and slept. Bread was mixed each morning and ovens glowed each evening. Many people spent their entire lives in the same village, walking the same paths and looking at the same fields. Seasons changed, children grew older, and rulers came and went, but for countless workers and farmers, the shape of daily life remained almost untouched. Long before sunrise, the first sounds of movement began inside mud-brick houses. The homes were simple and practical. Their walls held the coolness of the night for only a little while. Flat roofs rested above small rooms where families slept close together. Mats woven from reeds covered the floors. Clay jars stood against the walls, filled with grain, water, and oil. Wooden stools and low tables occupied the corners. In the darkness, people stirred from sleep before the heat of the day could arrive. A woman sat up slowly and listened to the breathing of her children. Beside her, her husband prepared to leave for the fields. There was no clock to announce the hour. Time was measured by habit, by the fading stars, by the distant cry of birds along the riverbank. Hands reached for sandals. Linen clothing was shaken free of dust. A lamp flickered softly, throwing golden light against rough walls. Outside, the village remained quiet. The streets between houses were narrow and uneven. Footprints from the previous day still marked the ground. Donkeys rested near wooden fences. Chickens scratched in the dirt. Smoke had not yet risen from the ovens, but soon the scent of baking bread would drift through the morning air. For many Egyptians, life followed a pattern that their parents had known and that their grandparents had known before them. A farmer understood his tasks because he had watched them since childhood. A potter shaped clay with movements that seemed older than memory. A fisherman prepared his nets in much the same way that his ancestors had done for generations. There was comfort in repetition, even when the work was difficult. The Nile stood at the center of everything. Before dawn, its surface reflected the pale light of the sky. Boats tied along the shore rocked gently against their ropes. Reeds whispered in the breeze. The river brought water to the fields, fish to the markets, and life to villages scattered across the land. Without it, the desert would have swallowed every settlement. Men walked toward the fields carrying simple tools across their shoulders. Their sandals pressed into the cool earth. They spoke quietly, saving their strength for the hours ahead. Some carried wooden hoes. Others guided donkeys loaded with baskets. The eastern horizon slowly brightened, and the outlines of distant palms began to appear. As sunlight spread across the valley, the world awakened. Women knelt beside grinding stones, crushing grain into flour. The sound of stone against stone became one of the familiar songs of the morning. It was steady and repetitive. Hands worked patiently, turning hard kernels into soft powder that could become bread. Children helped where they could. Older daughters carried water from nearby wells or from the river itself. Young boys chased goats from the roads and gathered firewood. The youngest children remained close to home, still wrapped in sleep as the village around them grew busy. Bread was the foundation of nearly every meal. Dough was mixed in clay bowls with water and grain. Ovens made from mud and straw trapped the heat of burning wood. Bakers worked in warm rooms long before the sun climbed high above the desert. The smell of fresh bread drifted through the streets and mixed with dust and smoke. People ate simply. Bread, onions, beans, fish, and dates filled ordinary tables. Beer, made from grain, was consumed by adults and children alike. It was thick and nourishing. Wealthier families enjoyed greater variety, but most people lived on modest meals that changed very little from one season to the next. As morning advanced, the fields came alive with labor. Farmers bent beneath the growing warmth. Water channels carried life from the river into the soil. Hands planted seeds and removed weeds. Oxen pulled wooden plows across the earth. Their slow footsteps left deep marks in the fields. The work demanded patience. Days could feel endless beneath the Egyptian sun. Sweat gathered on foreheads and darkened linen clothing. Dust clung to skin. Yet there was little choice. Harvests determined whether families would eat comfortably or endure hardship. Every season brought its own responsibilities, and each task depended on careful timing. Near the river, fishermen pushed their boats into the water. They untangled nets that had dried overnight and checked wooden poles for cracks. The Nile provided fish in abundance, but success still required effort and experience. A fisherman learned to read the movement of water and the habits of birds. He understood where fish gathered and where the currents changed. The river itself seemed timeless. Generation after generation stood upon the same banks and watched the same slow current. Children learned to swim in its shallows. Mothers washed clothing along its edges. Old men sat beneath trees and listened to distant voices carried by the wind. Farther from the villages, builders gathered near quarries and construction sites. Some shaped stone blocks beneath open skies. Others hauled materials along dusty roads. Their labor contributed to temples, tombs, walls, and monuments that would outlast them by thousands of years. Yet the builders themselves often lived ordinary lives marked by sore muscles, simple meals, and short hours of rest. The journey to a work site could begin before sunrise and end after sunset. Men walked together in groups, carrying tools made from wood, copper, and stone. Conversation drifted between them. They spoke of crops, family members, illness, and weather. They worried about aging parents and hoped for healthy children. Their concerns were not so different from those of countless generations across history. By midday, the heat settled heavily over the land. Shadows grew short. Air shimmered above the roads. Workers paused whenever possible to rest beneath trees or beside walls. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Bread was shared. Bodies ached. Inside homes, women continued their endless tasks. Floors were swept. Clothing was repaired. Grain was stored. Infants slept in the shade. The rhythm of domestic work rarely stopped. Even in moments of quiet, another chore always waited. The interiors of Egyptian houses held familiar sights. Clay containers lined shelves carved into walls. Reed baskets overflowed with food and tools. Mats covered sleeping areas. Small openings allowed air to circulate, though little relief came during the hottest months. Families gathered in these rooms at night, eating together beneath flickering lamplight. Not everyone worked with their hands in the fields or quarries. Scribes occupied a special place in society. Their days unfolded in courtyards, offices, and workshops where records were kept. They sat cross-legged with brushes and sheets of papyrus, carefully writing lists, accounts, and messages. A young apprentice scribe might spend hours copying symbols beneath the watchful eye of his teacher. Mistakes were corrected patiently. Writing required discipline and memory. While laborers carried stone and farmers bent over crops, scribes carried responsibilities of a different kind. Their work shaped the administration of villages, temples, and storehouses. Yet even scribes lived within the same cycles of sunrise and sunset. They ate the same bread, drank the same water from the Nile, and returned at evening to homes warmed by cooking fires. Markets brought another rhythm to Egyptian life. In larger settlements, traders arrived carrying goods from nearby villages. The roads filled with donkeys burdened by baskets of grain, pottery, vegetables, and cloth. Voices rose and fell as people exchanged goods and news. The marketplace was not a place of hurried movement. Transactions took time. Friends greeted one another. Neighbors paused to talk. Children wandered between stalls. Dust drifted through the warm air while merchants carefully arranged their wares. Potters shaped wet clay on simple wheels. Carpenters smoothed rough wood with copper tools. Weavers worked patiently with linen threads. Each craft depended upon countless small movements repeated day after day. Skill came from years of practice rather than sudden inspiration. In workshops, the sounds of labor blended together. Hammers struck stone. Wheels turned. Cloth rustled. Voices echoed beneath roofs supported by wooden beams. Apprentices observed older craftsmen and slowly learned the techniques that would support them throughout their lives. As the afternoon wore on, fatigue settled over the villages. The brightest sunlight softened. Workers wiped dust from their faces and prepared for the journey home. Feet followed familiar roads worn smooth by generations of travelers. The return home was often quieter than the morning departure. Muscles ached. Conversation slowed. Men carried tools that felt heavier than they had at dawn. Children ran ahead through narrow streets. Smoke rose from ovens as evening meals began. Inside homes, bread baked once more. Fish cooked over small fires. Families gathered on rooftops where cooler air offered relief from the heat trapped within the walls below. The colors of the sky shifted from gold to deep blue. Night brought a different world. Labor ended, but life continued. Stories were shared. Parents spoke softly to children. Lamps flickered in dark rooms. Somewhere beyond the village, jackals moved across the desert. Sleep in ancient Egypt was simple. Many people rested on mats stuffed with reeds or woven fibers. Some used wooden headrests instead of pillows. The sounds of insects drifted through open windows. The river continued its endless journey through the darkness. There were nights when illness visited a household. A fevered child might keep parents awake until dawn. An injured laborer might lie silently, his body exhausted from years of work. Ancient life was beautiful in some ways, but it was also fragile. Medicine existed, yet many ailments remained mysterious and frightening. People relied on remedies passed down through generations. Herbs were mixed into drinks. Oils were rubbed onto aching limbs. Prayers were whispered in hopes of relief. Families cared for one another as best they could, often with limited resources. Old age arrived differently for different people. Some workers aged quickly beneath years of physical labor. Their backs bent. Their hands stiffened. Their steps slowed. Younger family members gradually took on heavier responsibilities. Grandparents sat in shaded spaces and watched village life continue around them. Children learned through observation. A boy followed his father to the fields and memorized the patterns of farming. A girl stood beside her mother and practiced grinding grain or weaving cloth. Knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next, woven into ordinary routines. The seasons shaped every aspect of existence. When the Nile flooded, fields disappeared beneath water. Villages adapted. Boats traveled where people had once walked. Families waited patiently for the river to retreat and leave fertile soil behind. Flood season changed the rhythm of work. Farmers found themselves with different responsibilities. Some joined construction projects. Others repaired homes or tools. The cycle repeated year after year, familiar and expected. During harvest, the countryside filled with activity. Workers cut grain beneath the sun. Baskets overflowed. Donkeys carried heavy loads toward storage buildings. The smell of straw lingered in the air. Harvest was demanding, but it was also reassuring. Full storehouses promised survival through the months ahead. Families measured their fortunes not in coins but in food, livestock, and healthy children. Temples stood above many towns and villages, their walls catching the light of sunrise and sunset. Priests carried out rituals according to traditions that stretched back through centuries. Incense drifted through sacred halls. Offerings were placed before statues. Bells and voices echoed softly. For ordinary people, religion was woven into daily life rather than separated from it. Small prayers accompanied meals and journeys. Festivals interrupted routines only occasionally. Most days remained grounded in work, family, and survival. As darkness deepened once more, another cycle prepared to begin. The stars returned above the Nile. Lamps burned low inside mud-brick homes. Somewhere, a baker prepared grain for tomorrow's bread. Somewhere else, fishermen checked their nets beneath the moonlight. Thousands of lives moved together in quiet patterns. Most names would disappear from memory. Most stories would never be written down. Yet these ordinary men and women formed the true heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Their days were filled with familiar sounds, sandals brushing stone floors, distant voices in crowded markets, birds calling above river banks, grain falling into clay jars, water splashing against boats, and the slow crackle of cooking fires as evening settled over the valley. For many centuries, these rhythms changed very little. And as another dawn approached over the ancient river, countless sleeping households rested in the cool hours before morning, waiting once again for the soft light that would guide them back into the same quiet routines they had always known. Before the first glow of morning touched the eastern horizon, the villages along the Nile remained wrapped in darkness. The river moved quietly beside them, carrying cool air across the fields and through the narrow spaces between mud-brick walls. In those still hours, before ovens were lit and before footsteps filled the roads, Egypt felt almost asleep. The stars reflected in the water, and the desert beyond the fertile valley rested under a pale moon. Inside one small house, a family slept together in a single room. Their mats lay close to the floor, where the night air was slightly cooler. Clay jars stood in the corners, their shapes softened by darkness. The scent of dust, grain, and old smoke lingered in the room. A small oil lamp had burned low during the night, leaving only a faint glow against the wall. The father awoke first, as he often did. For many years, he had risen at nearly the same moment, long before the heat arrived. His body no longer needed the call of another voice. The habits of labor had settled deeply into him. Even in sleep, he seemed to know when the stars had reached a certain place above the village. He sat quietly for a few moments, listening to the familiar sounds around him. He heard the soft breathing of his children. Somewhere outside, a donkey shifted against its tether. The wind moved across the roof. Nothing had changed since yesterday, and tomorrow would likely feel the same. Across Egypt, thousands of men woke in much the same way. Farmers, fishermen, builders, guards, servants, and craftsmen all prepared themselves for another day that would follow the shape of countless days before it. The work ahead might differ from village to village, but the rhythm remained remarkably steady. The houses themselves had changed very little over generations. Builders shaped bricks from mud mixed with straw and left them to dry beneath the sun. Walls rose thick and sturdy, protecting families from the heat outside. The wealthiest people lived in larger homes with courtyards and storage rooms, but most families occupied smaller spaces that served many purposes at once. Children slept, played, ate, and listened to stories in the same rooms where grain was stored and meals were prepared. Privacy was rare. Life unfolded close together. Brothers and sisters shared sleeping mats. Grandparents often lived beneath the same roof. The voices of neighbors drifted easily through thin walls and open windows. Soon the mother awoke as well. Her day, like the day before it, would be filled with work that was necessary but seldom celebrated. Before sunrise she would grind grain. She would prepare bread, carry water, tend to children, repair clothing, and oversee countless small tasks that kept the household alive. The grinding of grain began in homes across the village. Women knelt beside heavy stones worn smooth by years of use. Their movements were practiced and steady. The sound of stone scraping against stone spread through the quiet streets, becoming one of the first signs that the day had begun. This work demanded strength. Flour did not appear easily. Every loaf of bread required patience and effort. Dust from the grain settled onto hands and clothing. Muscles ached from repetition. Yet the task continued each morning, almost unchanged from one generation to the next. Outside, the eastern sky slowly brightened. Birds gathered near the riverbanks, calling to one another from the reeds. Fishermen prepared their boats while the water still held the coolness of night. They checked ropes and nets by touch as much as by sight. Their fathers had taught them these habits when they were young boys, and one day they would teach their own sons. The fishermen understood the moods of the Nile. They noticed small changes in its current. They recognized the places where fish gathered and where the water grew deep. Long before written records described the river, ordinary people had learned to live beside it, listening to its rhythms and depending upon its generosity. As dawn spread across the valley, the fields awakened. Farmers walked between irrigation channels carrying tools across their shoulders. The earth beneath their feet remained damp from the river's gift. The smell of wet soil mixed with the scent of reeds and distant cooking fires. Many of these men had never traveled far from their homes. The boundaries of their world were simple. They knew the nearby villages, the riverbanks, the temples, and the fields that their families had worked for generations. The desert beyond seemed endless and mysterious, but daily life rarely required them to venture into it. Children gradually emerged into the morning light. Some rubbed sleep from their eyes while others immediately began helping with household tasks. Childhood in ancient Egypt was not separate from work. Even the youngest members of a family carried responsibilities. They fetched water, watched animals, swept floors, and learned the routines that would shape the rest of their lives. A little boy might spend his morning following older workers into the fields, carrying tools that were almost too heavy for him. A young girl might stand beside her mother, learning how to knead dough or mend torn linen. Lessons were not always spoken aloud. Knowledge moved from one pair of hands to another through repetition and observation. The heat of the day arrived slowly but inevitably. At first, sunlight warmed the tops of the palm trees and painted the walls of the houses in shades of gold. Then it climbed higher, filling courtyards and roads with brightness. Before long, the coolness of dawn disappeared completely. Workers adjusted their pace to the weather. Heavy labor was often done in the early hours before the sun reached its full strength. Men bent over fields or hauled stone while shadows remained long. By midday, every movement demanded greater effort. Near the great building sites, teams of laborers organized themselves into familiar groups. They carried limestone blocks, shaped stone surfaces, and repaired tools worn down by constant use. Dust covered their skin and settled into the folds of their clothing. Many years later, people would gaze at Egypt's monuments and wonder about the rulers who ordered their construction. Yet for the men who worked there, daily concerns remained ordinary. They worried about sore backs, empty food jars, and children with fevers. They counted the days until they could return home and rest. The labor camps themselves possessed their own routines. Workers slept in simple quarters and ate meals that provided strength for long days. Bread, onions, fish, and beer sustained them. In the evenings, conversations drifted between the sleeping places as men spoke about families waiting in distant villages. Some workers sang quietly as they labored, not from joy but from habit. Rhythmic sounds helped groups coordinate their movements. Voices rose and faded beneath the bright sky. The songs changed over time, but the purpose remained the same. In workshops closer to the towns, craftsmen settled into their own patterns. Potters shaped vessels from clay gathered along the Nile. Their hands pressed and turned the wet earth with practiced ease. Shelves filled with bowls, jars, and cups waiting to dry in the heat. Nearby, carpenters worked with wood that was often precious and difficult to obtain. They carved furniture, repaired doors, and fashioned tools needed by farmers and merchants. Sawdust drifted through shafts of sunlight. Hammers struck steadily against wooden pegs. Linen weavers sat for long hours at their looms. Their fingers moved through threads with quiet concentration. Cloth was essential in Egypt. It became clothing, blankets, bags, and coverings for countless objects. The work demanded patience, and the repetitive motions could occupy an entire day. Scribes occupied calmer spaces, though their labor also required endurance. Seated on the floor or beneath shaded roofs, they copied records onto papyrus sheets. Their writing preserved taxes, harvests, agreements, and official orders. Young students practiced symbols repeatedly until they could produce them without hesitation. Becoming a scribe offered relief from the hardest physical work, but it brought different burdens. Long hours bent over documents strained the body in other ways. Mistakes carried consequences. Accuracy mattered. As the morning continued, merchants traveled dusty roads connecting villages and towns. Donkeys carried baskets filled with grain, oil, fish, cloth, and pottery. The pace was slow. Travel under the Egyptian sun demanded patience. Roads were simple paths worn into the earth by countless footsteps. Sand gathered in low places. Stones shifted beneath sandals. Travelers measured distance not by numbers but by the movement of the sun and the time needed to reach familiar landmarks. The marketplaces they visited were places of conversation as much as exchange. News spread from village to village through merchants and travelers. Stories of floods, illnesses, births, and harvests passed from one person to another. In a world without written messages for most people, voices carried information across the land. At midday, shade became precious. Trees along the river offered temporary relief. Workers rested beside walls or beneath simple shelters made from reeds and cloth. Meals were modest but satisfying after long hours of labor. Bread remained at the center of nearly every meal. Some loaves were coarse and dense. Others included dates or herbs when families could afford them. Fish dried in the sun provided nourishment that lasted beyond the day it was caught. Onions and beans appeared on tables again and again. People ate slowly when they could. Conversation softened beneath the heavy air. The hottest hours encouraged silence. Even animals sought shelter from the relentless sun. For servants working inside wealthier households, the day followed another rhythm. Large homes required constant attention. Floors needed sweeping. Food had to be prepared and carried. Water jars had to be filled repeatedly. Laundry was washed and dried beneath the sun. Servants often began their tasks before the rest of the household awoke. Their labor remained largely invisible, woven quietly into the comfort enjoyed by others. Yet their own lives resembled those of ordinary workers in many ways. They returned to simple homes at the end of the day, shared meals with family members, and rose again before dawn. Illness lingered as an ever-present companion to ancient life. A cut on a worker's hand could become dangerous. Fever might spread through a household without warning. Dust irritated lungs. Hard labor damaged joints and muscles over the years. Healers relied on herbs, oils, and traditions passed down through generations. Some remedies offered comfort. Others depended as much on faith as on medicine. Families cared for the sick with patience, sitting beside sleeping mats and waiting through long nights. The old carried memories of floods and harvests from decades past. They remembered rulers whose names younger people barely recognized. Yet even their stories often returned to ordinary matters: seasons of poor crops, difficult summers, marriages, and births. Age revealed itself in small ways. Hands became rough and stiff. Walking grew slower. Faces lined by years of sunlight and wind reflected lives shaped by repetition. Elderly villagers spent more time in shaded courtyards, observing the familiar patterns unfolding around them. As afternoon faded, the color of the land began to soften. Workers finished their tasks for the day. Farmers secured tools and checked irrigation channels. Fishermen pulled boats onto shore and sorted their catches. Builders stacked equipment and prepared for tomorrow. The journey home unfolded beneath a sky turning gold. Dust rose beneath tired feet. Children ran through the streets, still full of energy despite the long day. Dogs barked from doorways. Smoke climbed into the evening air. Back inside the houses, cooking fires glowed warmly. Women prepared the evening meal while family members gathered nearby. The heat trapped inside the walls slowly escaped as darkness approached. Rooftops became places of comfort where people sat together beneath the stars. The night meal offered one of the few moments when families could rest together. Bread was broken and shared. Fish, vegetables, and beer passed from hand to hand. Stories from the day were exchanged quietly. A father might speak about a broken tool that needed repair. A mother might worry about grain supplies for the coming month. Children described small adventures that seemed important to them. Laughter appeared now and then, though life itself remained serious and demanding. When darkness fully settled across the valley, lamps illuminated the interiors of homes. Their light was soft and uneven. Shadows moved across the walls as flames flickered in the night breeze. Beyond the villages, the desert stretched outward beneath the stars. Travelers who crossed those distant sands often moved by moonlight to avoid the heat of day. Caravans advanced slowly, their footsteps disappearing behind them. But most Egyptians remained close to home. Their world centered on family, work, and the river that sustained them. The lives of kings and officials existed somewhere beyond the horizon, yet ordinary routines continued regardless of distant events. The Nile flowed quietly through every season. It carried boats northward and southward. It reflected the changing sky. It marked the passing years without ever truly changing itself. And in the stillness of another Egyptian night, as tired workers stretched out upon woven mats and children drifted into sleep, the same gentle cycle waited to begin again with the coming dawn. The darkest hours before sunrise were often the quietest moments in the Egyptian world. The ovens had gone cold, the markets were empty, and the roads between villages lay untouched beneath the stars. Only the Nile continued its endless movement through the valley, carrying water from distant lands into the fields that depended upon it. The river never seemed to sleep. Even in the silence of the night, it whispered against reeds and wooden boats tied along the shore. In one village, hidden among groves of date palms, an old man sat awake on the roof of his home. Sleep came more slowly to him than it once had. Years of work in the fields had stiffened his back and hardened his hands. He wrapped a linen cloth around his shoulders and watched the sky above him. He had seen many rulers rise and disappear. He had watched floods come and go. Children had been born, grown into adults, and begun families of their own. Yet when he looked down at the narrow streets below, very little seemed different from the world of his youth. The same mud-brick walls stood close together. The same clay ovens rested beside doorways. The same footsteps crossed the same dusty roads each day. New faces appeared as old ones vanished, but the shape of ordinary life endured with remarkable patience. Soon, as always, the village began to stir. A rooster called into the darkness. Someone opened a wooden door. A woman stepped outside carrying an empty jar, her sandals scraping softly against the earth. In another house, a child turned over in sleep as his mother prepared the morning fire. The beginning of each day followed familiar patterns that were rarely questioned. People did not wake expecting change. They woke expecting work. The first task for many households was water. Even though the Nile flowed nearby, carrying water into the valley, obtaining enough for daily life required constant effort. Clay jars had to be filled and carried home. Women and older children often walked together in the cool hours before sunrise, balancing heavy containers against their hips or shoulders. The paths leading to the river became worn from generations of footsteps. Children learned those routes almost as soon as they learned to walk. They knew where the ground became soft after the floods and where reeds grew thick along the banks. They recognized the sound of birds hidden among the plants and the gentle splash of fish near the shore. The river was never entirely quiet. Fishermen arrived before dawn, speaking in low voices as they untied their boats. Wooden hulls rubbed against one another in the darkness. Nets, still damp from the previous day, were carefully inspected for tears. Fishing demanded patience more than strength. Men spent long hours drifting along the river, watching the water and waiting for movement beneath the surface. Sometimes the catch was generous. Sometimes it was disappointingly small. The Nile gave much, but it also demanded respect. As the eastern sky brightened, the fields slowly emerged from the shadows. Farmers gathered their tools and walked toward the land that fed their families. The earth beside the Nile was rich and dark, very different from the endless desert beyond the valley. The boundaries between fertile land and empty sand were sharp. One step carried a man from green fields into dry wilderness. The contrast shaped the thoughts of those who lived there. Life belonged to the river. Beyond it stretched silence and heat. The farmers understood every stage of the agricultural year. They knew when the flood waters would rise. They knew when seeds should be planted and when harvest would begin. Their knowledge did not come from books. It came from observation repeated over lifetimes. A boy walking beside his father might hear the same instructions that his grandfather had once heard. Watch the water. Feel the soil. Look at the sky. Do not rush. These lessons remained unchanged because the land itself remained unchanged. By sunrise, labor had begun in earnest. Men worked in rows across the fields, bending beneath the growing warmth. Wooden plows, pulled by oxen, cut through the earth. Birds followed behind, searching for insects and scattered grain. The work was slow. Every movement had to be repeated hundreds of times. There were no shortcuts. A farmer could not hurry the seasons, and he could not escape the heat. As the sun climbed higher, sweat darkened linen clothing. Dust settled on faces and arms. Workers paused occasionally to drink water and wipe their foreheads, but rest was brief. In nearby villages, women continued the endless work of the household. Grain was ground into flour. Bread dough was kneaded. Clothing was washed and repaired. Children were fed. Animals were tended. The tasks changed with the seasons, but the rhythm remained constant. The grinding stones were among the most familiar objects in any Egyptian home. Day after day, women knelt beside them, pushing grain back and forth until it became flour. The work consumed hours. Fine dust covered their hands and settled into the folds of their clothing. Many women began this labor as girls and continued it into old age. Their mothers had done the same. Their daughters would follow. In the middle of the village, smoke rose from ovens as the first loaves of bread baked in the morning heat. The smell drifted through narrow streets and mixed with the scent of clay, animals, and the river beyond. Bread was more than food. It was the center of daily life. Families measured prosperity by the fullness of their grain jars. Workers received bread as payment. Travelers carried it on long journeys. Children learned to shape dough before they were old enough for heavier tasks. The wealthiest households enjoyed finer ingredients and larger meals, but even the simplest family depended upon the same basic foods. Fish from the Nile. Onions and beans. Dates and figs. Beer brewed from grain. These meals changed little across generations. At the edge of larger towns, workshops came alive as the morning progressed. Potters shaped wet clay with skilled hands. Their wheels turned steadily while sunlight poured through open doorways. Shelves filled with jars of every size. Some vessels would hold oil. Others would store grain. Some would carry water from the river. Every household depended upon the work of potters, yet their names rarely survived beyond their own villages. Nearby, weavers sat at wooden looms, pulling linen threads through careful patterns. The soft sound of cloth being made filled shaded rooms. Linen garments hung from walls and dried in the sun outside. Egypt was a world of fabric and dust. Loose linen clothing protected workers from the heat. Head coverings shielded faces from sunlight. Children often wore very little during the hottest months, running barefoot across the warm earth. In another corner of town, carpenters bent over their work. Wood was valuable, and little could be wasted. Broken furniture was repaired rather than replaced. Tools were sharpened again and again. The carpenter's workshop smelled different from the bakery or the pottery yard. Sawdust mixed with oil and smoke. Wooden shavings gathered on the floor. The sound of scraping and cutting echoed beneath the roof. Many craftsmen worked alongside their sons or nephews. Skills passed quietly from one generation to the next. A child spent years watching before being trusted with important tasks. The same pattern could be found among scribes. In schools attached to temples or government buildings, boys practiced writing under the eyes of older teachers. They copied symbols onto scraps of papyrus and pieces of limestone. Mistakes brought correction, and success required endless repetition. To become a scribe was to enter a different kind of labor. A scribe's hands remained cleaner than those of a farmer, but his work demanded patience of another kind. He recorded harvests, counted supplies, and copied official messages. Long hours spent over writing left their own marks on the body. Many parents dreamed of seeing a son become a scribe because it offered protection from the hardest physical work. Yet only a small number of children followed that path. For most people, life remained closely tied to the land. The midday heat eventually settled across the valley like a heavy blanket. By then, shadows had grown short. The roads shimmered in the sunlight. Even the animals sought shelter where they could find it. Workers rested beneath trees or beside walls. Meals were eaten slowly. Water jars passed from hand to hand. Conversations during these moments often returned to familiar subjects. How high would the river rise this year? Would the harvest be strong? Was a neighbor recovering from illness? Had a relative arrived safely from another village? Ordinary concerns filled ordinary lives. News traveled slowly through Egypt. A merchant arriving from a distant town might carry stories that spread from household to household. Travelers described markets, temples, and changing conditions along the river. But distant events often felt remote to those whose days revolved around planting, harvesting, cooking, and caring for children. Even the great monuments rising from the desert belonged to another world. For the laborers who hauled stone and shaped blocks beneath the sun, those enormous structures represented work rather than glory. They woke before dawn, carried tools, shared meals, and returned home exhausted. Their sleeping places were simple. A laborer's home offered little luxury. The walls protected against wind and heat. Reed mats covered the floors. Clay lamps pushed back the darkness. Families gathered closely together at night. The sounds inside those homes were gentle. The crackle of cooking fires. The whisper of conversation. The soft crying of an infant. The steady breathing of sleeping children. Outside, dogs wandered through narrow streets while donkeys rested near doorways. As afternoon slowly faded into evening, the pace of life changed once more. Farmers finished their work and guided animals home. Fishermen returned to shore with their catch. Merchants packed away their goods. Children played in the cooler air while mothers prepared the evening meal. The setting sun transformed the valley. Golden light touched the tops of palm trees. The Nile reflected shades of red and orange. Long shadows stretched across the fields. For a short time, the oppressive heat lifted. Families climbed onto flat rooftops to escape the warmth trapped inside their homes. Neighbors called quietly to one another across narrow streets. The scent of fresh bread and roasting fish drifted through the evening air. These were the hours when people could rest. An old woman might tell stories from her childhood. A father might repair a broken basket. Children might chase one another until darkness made play impossible. The stars appeared slowly above the desert. Without lamps bright enough to challenge the night, the heavens seemed vast and endless. Constellations moved across the sky in patterns that generations of Egyptians had watched and remembered. The stars accompanied every stage of life. They shone above births and funerals. They watched over harvests and droughts. They hung silently above fishermen crossing the river before dawn. For ordinary people, the night offered relief from labor but not always from worry. Illness remained close. A cough could linger for weeks. A fever could bring fear into a household. Injuries from heavy work healed slowly. Mothers sat beside sick children, touching warm foreheads while oil lamps flickered nearby. Healers prepared remedies from herbs, honey, and oils. Some treatments eased suffering. Others brought comfort simply because they offered hope. The elderly carried the signs of years spent working beneath the sun. Their backs bent. Their hands trembled. their steps became cautious. Many had buried friends and family members. They had witnessed floods that destroyed homes and seasons that brought abundance. Yet even after long lives, they often found themselves watching the same daily routines continue around them. Children still ran through dusty streets. Women still carried water. Men still left for the fields before sunrise. The river still flowed northward. Egypt changed slowly, almost imperceptibly. Years passed. Generations passed. Rulers changed. Temples expanded. New children were born into old traditions. And beneath all of it, ordinary life continued in its steady rhythm, moving from darkness into dawn and from sunset back into night, just as it always had beside the quiet waters of the Nile. There were mornings in ancient Egypt when the world seemed to awaken so slowly that the line between night and day almost disappeared. The eastern sky lightened little by little, and a pale silver glow spread across the river. The stars faded without hurry. Cool air drifted over the fields, carrying the smell of damp earth and reeds. In those moments, before the heat returned, the valley belonged to silence. Along the banks of the Nile, fishermen were already at work. Their boats slipped through the dark water with barely a sound. Wooden oars dipped gently into the current, creating small circles that widened and vanished. Some men cast nets that had been repaired many times over the years. Others lowered woven traps into the shallows, trusting the same methods their fathers had used. The river gave shape to every day. It determined when people planted their crops and when they gathered their harvest. It decided which villages prospered and which struggled through difficult seasons. Even those who rarely stepped into a boat felt the presence of the Nile in every loaf of bread and every jar of water. As the first sunlight touched the roofs of the villages, smoke began to rise from clay ovens. Women fed small pieces of wood into the fires while children carried baskets of grain across courtyards. The smell of baking bread drifted into the streets, mixing with the scent of dust that never truly disappeared from the Egyptian air. In one home, a mother sat beside a grinding stone, moving it back and forth with practiced strength. Her hands followed movements that she had learned as a girl. Beside her, her youngest child still slept on a woven mat, unaware that the work of the day had already begun around him. The labor inside a household rarely stopped. Every object required care. Every meal demanded preparation. Linen clothing had to be washed in river water and left to dry beneath the sun. Clay jars needed to be filled. Floors had to be swept. Animals had to be fed. Many women spent nearly their entire lives within this rhythm. They measured time not by the years of kings or the construction of monuments but by smaller events. They remembered the season when the river flooded particularly high. They remembered the summer when sickness spread through the village. They remembered births, marriages, and the quiet evenings when the family gathered on the roof to escape the heat. Outside the villages, farmers moved into the fields as the light strengthened. They walked familiar paths, often speaking very little. Their bodies still carried the heaviness of yesterday's work, and before long they would carry the weight of another day. The fields nearest the river were green and full of life. Water channels stretched across the land, guiding precious water toward rows of crops. Men used simple tools to clear weeds and repair the narrow banks that kept the water flowing where it was needed. The work was repetitive, but repetition itself had become a kind of certainty. A farmer could not control the river, the weather, or illness, but he could wake before dawn and follow the routines that had always sustained his family. Sometimes young children accompanied their parents into the fields. They watched and listened. At first, they carried only small baskets or simple tools. Over time, they learned to recognize the condition of the soil, the changing color of the sky, and the subtle signs that told experienced farmers when to plant or harvest. There were few lessons written on papyrus for ordinary people. Most knowledge lived in memory. It passed from one generation to another through shared labor and quiet observation. Farther away, in towns where workshops lined the streets, another kind of work was beginning. Potters stepped into their courtyards and examined rows of vessels drying in the morning sun. They mixed fresh clay with water and sat before spinning wheels. Their hands moved without hesitation, shaping bowls, jars, and cups that looked much like those made by their grandfathers. A cracked pot might be repaired several times before it was finally discarded. Resources were too valuable to waste. Wood, cloth, grain, and tools all required effort to obtain. People learned to preserve what they owned and to mend what had broken. Nearby, stonecutters and builders prepared for another long day. Their work sites stood beneath open skies, where the heat would soon become difficult to bear. Copper chisels, wooden sledges, ropes, and hammers lay ready on the ground. Many laborers worked in teams that had been together for years. They knew one another's voices and habits. They shared food and stories. During the hottest hours of the day, they rested in whatever shade they could find, speaking quietly about their families and the conditions in their villages. The monuments they built would survive for thousands of years, but their own lives remained ordinary. At night, they returned to simple homes, worried about illness, argued with neighbors, and comforted tired children. Their hands shaped history, yet their days were filled with the same concerns as everyone around them. As the sun climbed higher, the sounds of Egypt grew louder. Donkeys carried baskets through narrow roads. Merchants called to customers in crowded markets. Children laughed in dusty courtyards. Hammers struck wood and stone. Birds circled above the riverbanks. Even so, there was no sense of hurry. Life moved at the pace of human hands and feet. Distances that would later seem short required hours of walking. News traveled slowly from village to village. Most people spent their entire lives within the same small corner of the valley. For a merchant, however, the road offered a different existence. Before sunrise, he might load his animals with jars of oil, baskets of dates, or bolts of linen. He would travel along familiar paths, stopping at villages where customers already knew him. The journey was tiring, especially during the hottest months, but it brought him stories from distant places. As he rested beneath a tree beside the road, he might describe a temple he had visited far to the south or speak of a poor harvest in another region. Villagers gathered around him, eager to hear about lands they would probably never see. Still, when the conversation ended, everyone returned to the routines that defined their lives. In larger households, servants moved constantly from room to room. They carried water, swept floors, and prepared meals. Their work often began before sunrise and ended long after darkness had fallen. The homes of wealthy officials contained more space and greater comfort than those of ordinary workers, but they also demanded more labor to maintain. Courtyards needed cleaning. Gardens required attention. Guests had to be welcomed and fed. Servants witnessed the private lives of their employers while carrying burdens of their own. They worried about aging parents, sick children, and empty grain jars. At the end of the day, they left the larger houses behind and returned to neighborhoods that looked much like every other village along the Nile. As midday approached, the heat became nearly unbearable. The bright sky seemed endless above the valley. Dust rose from every road and settled on every surface. The stone walls of houses trapped the warmth, while the fields shimmered in the distance. People adapted as best they could. Workers paused to drink water from clay jars buried partly in the ground to keep them cool. Some rested beneath palm trees. Others sat in the shade of walls, eating bread and onions in silence. During these quiet moments, conversations often drifted toward memories. Older men recalled seasons when the flood waters had come late. Women spoke about relatives who had married into neighboring villages. Children listened to stories that mixed everyday experience with old traditions. Time in Egypt did not feel fast. Days stretched beneath the sun. Months followed the rise and fall of the river. Years were marked by harvests rather than numbers. For most people, life was not measured by dramatic events but by countless small repetitions. The same sandals were repaired again and again. The same tools passed from father to son. The same songs were sung while grain was ground. The same prayers were whispered at the end of the day. When afternoon finally softened into evening, workers began the journey home. The roads filled once more with tired footsteps. Farmers carried tools over their shoulders. Fishermen balanced baskets of their catch. Craftsmen locked away valuable supplies. Dust clung to their clothing and skin. Children, who had spent the day helping or playing, ran ahead through the streets. Dogs barked at passing donkeys. Smoke curled into the air from cooking fires that had already been lit. Evening meals were simple but welcome. Bread was broken apart and shared among family members. Fish roasted over small flames. Dates and vegetables appeared on low tables. Beer was poured into cups worn smooth by years of use. Families often gathered on the rooftops of their homes after eating. Up there, the air moved more freely. The sounds of the village drifted upward in soft waves, distant conversation, footsteps in the street, the cry of a child who refused sleep. The rooftops became places of rest. An old man leaned against the wall and looked toward the river. A mother braided her daughter's hair. Two brothers whispered about tomorrow's work. Grandparents told stories they themselves had heard as children. As darkness spread across the valley, lamps flickered to life in hundreds of homes. Their small flames cast long shadows across mud-brick walls. Beyond the villages, the desert became a vast sea of darkness beneath the stars. Night carried its own sounds. The wind moved across the sand. Insects chirped among the reeds. Water touched the shore in gentle rhythms. Somewhere in the distance, a boatman guided his vessel along the Nile beneath the moonlight. Inside their homes, families prepared for sleep. Mats were unrolled onto the floor. Children settled beside parents and grandparents. The youngest often fell asleep while listening to quiet conversations that faded into whispers. For many workers, sleep came quickly. Their bodies were exhausted from carrying stone, plowing fields, rowing boats, or grinding grain. Muscles ached. Hands were rough and sore. Yet even in sleep, tomorrow was already waiting. Before dawn, the ovens would burn again. The fishermen would return to the river. Farmers would step into the fields. Merchants would load their animals. Women would grind grain beneath the morning sky. Children would continue learning the routines that had shaped Egyptian life for countless generations. And through it all, the Nile would keep flowing, patient and unchanged, beneath the stars above the quiet valley. The night beside the Nile passed slowly, almost gently, as if the darkness itself moved with the same calm rhythm that guided every Egyptian life. The river continued flowing beneath the moon, carrying small waves against the shore. Boats rested quietly, tied to wooden posts. The villages slept, but they were never completely silent. There was always some small sign of life. A baby crying softly before being comforted. A donkey shifting outside a home. A fisherman preparing equipment for the early morning. A lamp being protected from the wind. A voice speaking quietly through an open doorway. These sounds were ordinary. They were not recorded in grand histories. They did not appear on the walls of temples. Yet they were the sounds that filled the lives of most people who lived along the Nile. When morning arrived again, it brought the same familiar responsibilities. The sun rose. The river moved. The fields waited. The ovens needed to be lit. The animals needed attention. The work continued. For an Egyptian farmer, the land was not simply a place where crops grew. It was a companion that required understanding. The farmer watched the color of the soil, the strength of the plants, and the movement of the water. He knew that a good harvest depended on many things beyond his control. A sudden change in the river could affect an entire village. Too little water meant dry fields and uncertain meals. Too much water could damage homes and destroy stored supplies. The people of Egypt lived with this uncertainty, but they also lived with deep familiarity. The rise and fall of the Nile was a cycle they had known since childhood. During the flood season, the landscape transformed. The river expanded beyond its usual boundaries, covering the fields with dark water. Paths disappeared. Boats traveled over places where farmers usually walked. The land rested beneath the flood, waiting for the moment when new planting could begin. For many people, the flood was not a time of fear but a time of adjustment. Work changed. Farmers repaired tools. Homes were maintained. Storage areas were checked. Some workers traveled to other places where labor was needed. Life moved according to the river's timing. The flood was part of the ancient Egyptian understanding of the world. It was not separate from daily life. It shaped meals, work, celebrations, and even the way people thought about time itself. When the waters finally began to retreat, the fields were covered with rich soil. Farmers returned with their tools and began preparing the earth again. The first touch of a wooden hoe breaking the ground marked the beginning of another season. The farmer bent down. The soil opened. Seeds were placed carefully. The future harvest began with small actions repeated across thousands of fields. Nearby, children watched these moments closely. They learned that food did not simply appear. Every loaf of bread carried the memory of countless hours of work. Every basket of grain represented the effort of farmers, families, and communities. This understanding shaped the way people valued simple things. A full grain jar meant security. A healthy animal meant support. A strong fishing net meant another meal. A repaired tool meant another day of work. Nothing was easily replaced. In many Egyptian homes, objects remained for years. A bowl might pass from one generation to another. A wooden stool might be repaired many times before finally disappearing. Clothing was patched and reused until the fabric became too worn to continue. This careful use of resources came from necessity, but it also became part of everyday thinking. People learned patience. They learned maintenance. They learned that life depended on caring for what they already had. The same patience appeared in Egyptian craftsmanship. A stoneworker could spend days shaping a single piece of material. A sculptor could spend months creating details that few people would ever notice closely. A weaver could spend countless hours producing cloth that would eventually become an ordinary garment. The makers understood that their work required time. There was no expectation of immediate completion. The world around them moved slowly, and their hands moved slowly with it. In the quiet corners of workshops, apprentices watched older craftsmen repeat the same movements thousands of times. A young potter learned how much pressure to apply to wet clay. A young carpenter learned how to recognize different types of wood. A young metal worker learned how heat changed copper. Mistakes were part of learning. A broken pot became a lesson. A damaged tool became an opportunity to improve. Knowledge grew through repetition. This was true for nearly every profession in ancient Egypt. A fisherman learned the river by spending years upon it. A farmer learned the land by walking through it. A baker learned dough by touching it. A builder learned stone by shaping it. A scribe learned writing by copying symbols again and again. Life was built upon memory and practice. In the evenings, when families gathered after work, they often shared stories about the day. A farmer might complain about a stubborn animal. A fisherman might describe a difficult current. A child might proudly show a small task completed for the first time. These moments were simple, but they were important. They connected one day to another. They connected one generation to the next. They reminded people that even ordinary lives contained meaning. The elderly played an important role in preserving these memories. They were the living connection between the past and the present. An old woman sitting beneath the shade of a palm tree might remember songs her mother taught her. An old man repairing a fishing net might remember when he first learned the skill as a child. Their stories carried the experiences of people who had already disappeared. Ancient Egypt was filled with monuments made of stone, but much of its true history lived in voices that were never carved into walls. It lived in the habits of families. It lived in the preparation of food. It lived in the movements of workers. It lived in the quiet routines repeated every morning. The lives of ordinary Egyptians were not usually dramatic. There were no constant changes, no endless journeys, no sudden transformations. Instead, there was continuity. A child often grew up to follow the same occupation as a parent. A family might live in the same home for many years. A village might remain almost identical across generations. The landscape itself encouraged this feeling of permanence. The desert stood beyond the fields, unchanged and endless. The Nile flowed through the center of life. The stars returned every night. The seasons followed their familiar path. For many Egyptians, the world felt like a great cycle rather than a straight road towards something new. This did not mean life was easy. The physical demands were heavy. A farmer's back carried years of bending and lifting. A builder's hands carried scars from tools and stone. A fisherman's skin showed the effects of sun and water. A mother's days were filled with endless responsibilities. People experienced pain, loss, and hardship. Children sometimes died young. Illness could arrive without warning. Poor harvests created difficult months. Work accidents could change a person's life forever. But within these challenges, people also found comfort in familiarity. They knew their place. They knew their duties. They knew the rhythms of the world around them. A worker returning home after a long day knew that his family would be waiting. A child waking in the morning knew the smell of fresh bread would soon fill the house. A farmer looking across the fields knew that the same river that helped his parents would help him. The repetition of life created a kind of peace. As the evening arrived once again, the villages became quieter. The markets closed. The workshops emptied. The fields rested. Only the sounds of preparation remained. A woman washed dishes beside the doorway. A father repaired a tool for tomorrow. A child fell asleep while listening to a story. The sky darkened above the valley, and the first stars appeared. The Nile reflected their light. Small boats moved slowly through the darkness. A fisherman guided his vessel by familiar landmarks, knowing every bend of the river. A farmer rested beside his family, his body tired but his mind calm. Another day had passed. Nothing extraordinary had happened. No great battle had changed the world. No sudden event had transformed ordinary lives. The sun had risen. People had worked. Families had eaten. The river had flowed. And that was exactly what made life in ancient Egypt feel so steady. For thousands of people across the valley, the greatest part of existence was not found in moments of change. It was found in the quiet certainty that tomorrow would arrive just like today. The ovens would warm again. The fields would wait again. The Nile would continue its journey again. And beneath the peaceful Egyptian sky, another generation would wake to the same gentle rhythm that had carried their ancestors through countless mornings before them. The first light of morning slowly returned to the valley, spreading across the Nile like a thin veil of gold. The darkness faded from the fields, and the shapes of palm trees became visible once again. Birds moved between the reeds. Small boats rested along the shore, waiting for the hands that would guide them into the water. Another day was beginning. For the people of ancient Egypt, mornings were not moments of sudden change. They were quiet openings into a familiar world. The same paths waited beneath their feet. The same walls surrounded their homes. The same river flowed beside their villages. Life was built around repetition. Not the kind of repetition that felt empty, but the kind that created comfort. A person knew what the day would bring. They knew the work required of them. They knew the sounds that would fill the streets and the faces they would meet. In a world where nature could be unpredictable, these routines offered something steady. A farmer who stepped into his field knew the feel of the soil beneath his sandals. A fisherman who pushed his boat into the Nile knew the movement of the current. A baker who prepared bread knew the texture of the dough beneath his hands. A mother who cared for her family knew every corner of her home. Each person carried a small piece of knowledge that had been passed down through time. The village itself was like a living memory. The oldest houses held stories that stretched back decades. The narrow streets had been shaped by countless footsteps. The walls had witnessed births, celebrations, arguments, and quiet evenings. Children grew up surrounded by the same places their parents had known. They played near the same riverbanks. They walked the same roads. They learned the same traditions. Their world was small, but it was deeply familiar. For many Egyptians, leaving home was unusual. Travel existed, but most people spent their lives close to the land where they were born. A village contained everything that mattered. Family, work, food, faith, community. The outside world existed, but daily life remained focused on the immediate surroundings. A person could spend years knowing every tree, every path, and every bend in the river near their home. This closeness created strong connections between people and places. A fisherman did not simply know the Nile as a source of food. He knew it as a part of his identity. He recognized the sounds of different seasons. He noticed when birds arrived and when plants changed along the shore. A farmer did not simply see a field. He saw the work of his ancestors. He saw the place where his children would one day work. The land carried memories. During the quiet hours after sunrise, farmers moved through fields covered with morning moisture. Their hands checked plants carefully. They removed weeds and repaired small problems before they became larger ones. The work was slow because the land demanded patience. A farmer could not force crops to grow faster. He could only prepare, protect, and wait. This patience shaped the way people viewed life itself. The Egyptians understood cycles. The river rose and fell. The moon appeared and disappeared. The seasons returned. Children became adults. Adults became elders. Everything moved in circles. This feeling of returning patterns was present everywhere. In the kitchen. In the fields. In the workshops. In the temples. In the homes. Even the preparation of a simple meal followed a familiar sequence that had been repeated for generations. Grain was gathered. Grain was ground. Dough was prepared. Bread was baked. Food was shared. The process connected families to the past. A grandmother preparing bread might use the same methods her grandmother had used. The same movements continued through the years, carried quietly from one pair of hands to another. The same was true with clothing. Linen was valuable because it required effort to produce. Plants had to be grown, fibers collected, threads created, and cloth woven carefully. A simple piece of clothing represented many hours of work. People treated their garments with care. A torn piece was repaired. A worn section was reused. Nothing was thrown away without thought. The warm climate meant clothing was often light and practical. Loose linen allowed air to move around the body. Sandals protected feet from rough ground. Head coverings helped shield workers from the harsh sun. For laborers spending long days outdoors, clothing was not about appearance. It was about survival. The same practical thinking shaped homes. Mud brick houses were designed for the environment. Thick walls helped keep interiors cooler during the day and warmer during cooler nights. Small openings allowed air to pass through. Homes were not places of luxury for most people. They were places of rest. A place where workers could remove their sandals after a long day. A place where families could eat together. A place where children could sleep safely beside their parents. At night, these simple homes became quiet shelters from the outside world. The sounds of labor disappeared. The heat faded. The family gathered. For a few hours, the struggles of the day became distant. But before that peaceful evening arrived, there were many hours of work. In construction areas, workers continued their demanding routines beneath the open sky. Stone blocks waited to be moved. Tools needed repair. Surfaces needed shaping. Dust covered everything. The labor was physically exhausting, but it was organized. Teams worked together because cooperation was necessary. One person could not move a heavy stone alone. One person could not complete a large task without help. The workers depended on one another. They shared strength. They shared knowledge. They shared the difficult moments. During breaks, they sat together in the shade. They ate simple meals and spoke about ordinary things. A worker might talk about his son learning a new skill. Another might mention a daughter preparing for marriage. Someone might worry about an elderly parent. These conversations reminded them that behind every laborer was a personal story. The stones they carried were large, but their own lives were filled with small concerns. The same was true for fishermen returning from the river. A successful day brought satisfaction. A poor catch brought disappointment. But either way, the fisherman returned home. He repaired his nets. He cleaned his tools. He prepared for another morning. The river demanded consistency. The fish did not arrive because someone wished for them. They arrived because people returned every day and continued trying. This steady effort was one of the defining qualities of ancient Egyptian life. People continued. They adapted. They repeated. They endured. Merchants experienced a slightly different rhythm. Their days involved movement between places. They carried goods and negotiated exchanges, but even their lives followed familiar patterns. A merchant knew which villages welcomed travelers. He knew which roads became difficult after floods. He knew which markets were busiest during certain seasons. Experience was his guide. The older he became, the more valuable his knowledge became. In ancient Egypt, age often represented wisdom because many skills depended on years of observation. An older worker understood things that could not easily be taught. He knew the warning signs of changing weather. He knew how tools behaved after years of use. He knew how to solve small problems before they became serious. Young people listened because experience mattered. The passing of knowledge was one of the strongest connections between generations. Parents did not simply raise children. They prepared them to continue the cycle. A father taught his son how to farm. A mother taught her daughter how to manage a household. A craftsman trained an apprentice. A scribe guided a student. The future was created through repetition. Every generation received the world from those before them and slowly prepared it for those who would come after. As evening approached, the valley softened again. The golden light returned. The workday ended. The same roads that had carried workers away in the morning now carried them home. A farmer walked slowly with his tools. A fisherman carried baskets from the river. A craftsman closed the entrance to his workshop. A child waited near the doorway, watching for the return of a parent. These small moments were the true center of Egyptian life. Not grand ceremonies. Not distant royal decisions. Not the names of powerful rulers. But the simple return home after a long day. Inside the houses, lamps were lit. The smell of food filled the air. Families gathered close. The walls that protected them during the heat of day now surrounded them with warmth. Outside, the village became quieter. The voices of neighbors slowly disappeared. The river continued flowing. The stars appeared. And once again, ancient Egypt entered the peaceful hours of night. The people who lived there did not know that thousands of years later, others would wonder about their lives. They did not know that their homes, tools, and daily habits would become windows into a distant world. They were simply living. They were waking, working, eating, resting, caring for one another, following the same gentle rhythm that had shaped their families for generations. And beneath the endless Egyptian sky, beside the quiet waters of the Nile, another ordinary day came to rest. The quiet night over the Nile carried the same peaceful rhythm that had existed for countless generations. The villages rested beneath the stars, their mud-brick walls holding the warmth of the day while the cooler desert air moved gently through the streets. Somewhere, a small fire still burned. Somewhere else, a fisherman prepared his tools for the morning. Somewhere, a mother whispered softly to a child who was struggling to fall asleep. Ancient Egypt was a world where the passing of time could be felt through simple things. The changing position of the sun. The rising and falling of the river. The growth of crops. The aging of family members. The wearing down of tools. The rebuilding of homes. Time was not measured only by numbers. It was felt through the body and through the land. A person knew how many seasons had passed because they remembered the floods. They knew how many years had gone by because children had become adults. They knew the passage of life through small changes that happened slowly. A young boy who once carried tiny baskets beside his mother eventually became the worker carrying heavy loads. The young girl who once watched bread being prepared eventually became the person preparing meals for her own family. The cycle continued quietly. In the early morning hours, before the streets became busy, elderly villagers often sat outside their homes. Their days were slower now. They no longer carried the same burdens as younger workers, but they remained important members of the community. They offered advice. They told stories. They remembered. An old farmer could look across the fields and recognize changes that others might miss. He could see when the soil needed attention. He could explain the signs of approaching weather. He could remember years when the river rose higher or lower than expected. His knowledge was not written in books. It lived inside him. The same was true of many older craftsmen. A potter who had spent decades shaping clay understood small details that a young apprentice could not yet see. He knew the right amount of water to add. He knew how long a vessel needed to dry. He knew the sound of good clay when it was struck. These skills were quiet treasures. They existed in ordinary people. They were carried through hands, voices, and repeated actions. Across the villages of Egypt, mornings continued to begin in the same way. The first light touched the rooftops. Doors opened. Fires were prepared. Animals were fed. Tools were collected. The valley slowly awakened. For workers who lived near construction areas, the beginning of the day brought another long walk toward labor. The road itself became part of their routine. They knew every turn. They knew where the ground was uneven. They knew where shade could be found during the hottest hours. The journey was not simply a way to reach work. It was another part of daily life. Men walked together, carrying their tools and speaking quietly. Some discussed the weather. Some talked about their families. Some remained silent, saving their energy for the work ahead. The sound of sandals moving across dusty ground became one of the familiar sounds of the Egyptian morning. At the work sites, the day unfolded through cooperation. A large task required many hands. Workers moved together. They lifted together. They rested together. They shared food together. The strength of the group mattered more than the strength of one person. The labor was tiring, but it also created a sense of belonging. People who worked side by side for many years became connected through shared experiences. They knew who worked quickly. They knew who needed more time. They knew who brought stories from home. They knew who always repaired broken tools. These small relationships shaped the daily lives of workers. The same feeling existed among farmers. A village depended on cooperation. Neighbors helped repair irrigation channels. Families supported one another during harvest. People shared resources when times were difficult. Life beside the Nile was not lived alone. The river connected communities, but so did everyday kindness. A person might help a neighbor carry a heavy jar of water. Someone might share bread with a family experiencing hardship. A fisherman might give part of his catch to an elderly person who could no longer work. These actions were simple, but they helped villages survive. The markets also reflected this connection. They were places where people exchanged goods, but they were also places where relationships were maintained. A merchant did not meet strangers every day. He often saw familiar faces. The same customers returned. The same conversations happened. The same greetings were exchanged. Trust mattered. A person's reputation could last for many years. In a world without fast communication, personal relationships were essential. People depended on memory. They remembered who could be trusted. They remembered who offered fair exchanges. They remembered who treated others with respect. As the day continued, the heat grew stronger. The Egyptian sun was a constant presence. It shaped clothing. It shaped architecture. It shaped working habits. People learned to adjust their lives around it. The hottest hours encouraged slower movement. Heavy tasks were avoided when possible. Rest became necessary. Even animals changed their behavior. Donkeys stood quietly in the shade. Birds disappeared into cooler places. Dogs searched for relief from the heat. The entire valley seemed to slow. Inside homes, the thick mud brick walls offered some protection. Families rested in darker rooms where the sunlight was weaker. Children played quietly. Older people conserved their strength. The sounds from outside became distant. The wind moved through small openings. The smell of stored grain filled the air. Clay jars kept water cool. The simple design of these homes reflected generations of experience. People built according to the environment they understood. They used materials available around them. Mud, reeds, stone, wood. The landscape itself provided what they needed. In the evening, when the heat finally faded, activity returned. People stepped outside again. The streets became alive with voices. Children played. Neighbors talked. Workers returned from fields and workshops. The transition from day to night was gentle. There was no sudden separation between work and rest. The village slowly changed its rhythm. Cooking fires appeared one by one. Smoke rose above the rooftops. The smell of food moved through the air. Inside homes, families prepared their meals. The evening meal was often one of the most peaceful parts of the day. After hours of labor, people finally sat together. They ate slowly. They listened. They shared stories. A father might describe something that happened at the worksite. A mother might speak about a child's progress. An older relative might tell a story from many years before. The past remained close because stories were one of the ways people preserved memory. Without written records for most families, spoken stories carried traditions forward. Children learned where their family came from. They learned the names of ancestors. They learned lessons about patience, honesty, and responsibility. The stories were not always about famous people. Often, they were about ordinary moments. A difficult harvest. A journey to another village. A family celebration. A surprising event along the river. These small memories were valuable because they represented real lives. As darkness deepened, people prepared for sleep. Tools were placed safely away. Animals were settled. Doors were closed. Lamps burned softly. The same homes that had been full of activity during the day became quiet shelters. For many workers, sleep was deep and immediate. Their bodies carried the weight of their labor. A farmer who had spent the day bending over fields felt the exhaustion in his muscles. A builder who had lifted stone felt it in his shoulders. A fisherman who had fought against river currents felt it in his arms. Rest was not a luxury. It was necessary. The next day depended on it. Yet even during sleep, the connection to daily life remained. Dreams occurred beneath the same stars that had watched over generations before. The Nile continued moving. The desert remained silent. The villages waited for morning. The people of ancient Egypt lived within a world that moved slowly, but slow did not mean empty. Their days were filled with countless small moments. The sound of bread being made. The feeling of warm sunlight on stone walls. The smell of river water after sunrise. The touch of rough tools in tired hands. The comfort of family gathered at night. These were the details that shaped ordinary existence. The great monuments of Egypt were built from stone, but the true foundation of the civilization was made from daily habits. Millions of small actions repeated across thousands of years. Farmers planting seeds. Families preparing meals. Workers carrying materials. Craftsmen shaping objects. Children learning from elders. Each person adding one small movement to a much larger rhythm. And as another night settled over the valley, the ancient Egyptian world continued exactly as it had for so long. Quiet. Patient. Familiar. The river flowed beneath the moon. The stars watched from above. And within the simple walls of countless homes, people rested peacefully, ready to begin the same timeless cycle once again when morning returned. The hours before sunrise were always a quiet reminder that life in ancient Egypt moved in circles. The darkness slowly loosened its hold over the valley, and the first birds began to call from the reeds along the Nile. The air was still cool, carrying the faint scent of water and earth. The desert remained silent beyond the green fields, waiting beneath the fading stars. Inside the homes, families began another morning. A hand reached for a clay jar. A small fire was prepared. A wooden door opened. A child stirred from sleep. The day began without announcement, without hurry, and without surprise. For most Egyptians, the morning did not bring a new beginning in the way people of distant times might imagine. It brought another continuation. Another day connected to all the days that came before it. The same tasks waited. The same responsibilities returned. The same familiar places welcomed them. This steady rhythm was the foundation of life along the Nile. In a small farming village, a young man stepped outside carrying a wooden tool across his shoulder. He followed the path toward the fields, a path that his father had walked many times before him. He knew every turn in the road. He knew where the ground became softer near the river. He knew where wild plants grew after the floods. The land was not something separate from his life. It was part of him. The fields provided food, but they also provided identity. A farmer understood himself through his relationship with the soil and the river. His days were connected to things that existed long before him and would continue long after him. As he reached the fields, other workers were already arriving. They greeted each other quietly. There was no need for long conversations. They had worked together for years and understood the movements of the day. One person repaired a water channel. Another prepared the tools. Another checked the crops. The work began slowly, almost naturally. The Egyptian farmer was a person of patience. He knew that the earth could not be rushed. Seeds required time. Plants required care. Harvest required waiting. This understanding extended beyond farming. Life itself was viewed through patience. A child became an adult slowly. A skill was learned slowly. A house was built slowly. A reputation was created slowly. Nothing important happened instantly. This was a world where people trusted gradual change. Near the river, fishermen moved through the morning mist. The Nile was calm, reflecting the colors of the sky. Their boats were simple, designed for movement through familiar waters. The fishermen watched carefully. They noticed small movements beneath the surface. They listened to the sound of birds. They understood the changing behavior of the river. Their knowledge came from years of experience. A young fisherman learned from an older one, just as he had once learned from someone before him. The river itself became a teacher. There were no written instructions explaining every detail. The lessons came through observation. Watch. Remember. Practice. Repeat. The same process shaped nearly every occupation in ancient Egypt. A craftsman did not become skilled in a single day. A builder did not understand stone immediately. A scribe did not master writing quickly. Every ability required years of quiet effort. In workshops, this patience could be seen everywhere. A young apprentice stood beside an experienced potter, watching carefully as clay turned beneath skilled hands. The older craftsman did not need to explain every movement. The apprentice learned through watching the small details. The pressure of fingers. The speed of rotation. The amount of water added. The moment when the shape was complete. These small pieces of knowledge created mastery. The same was true for weaving. A young woman learning to create linen cloth spent many hours beside someone more experienced. She watched how threads were arranged. She learned how to fix mistakes. She learned that good work required calm attention. The loom moved back and forth. The threads crossed. The cloth slowly appeared. The process itself reflected the pace of Egyptian life. Slow. Careful. Steady. In the larger towns, merchants continued their daily routines. Their stalls displayed goods from different regions. Baskets of grain sat beside jars of oil. Linen cloth rested beside pottery. Fish and vegetables were arranged for customers. The market was filled with movement, but even here, life moved at a human pace. People spoke face to face. They negotiated slowly. They exchanged stories along with goods. A visit to the market was not only about buying and selling. It was also a social moment. Neighbors met. Families exchanged news. Travelers shared information from distant places. A person might enter the market needing bread and leave knowing about a marriage in another village or a successful harvest somewhere along the river. The market was a place where the community remained connected. Beyond the towns, along dusty roads crossing the desert edges, travelers continued their journeys. Their pace was controlled by animals, weather, and distance. A donkey carrying supplies could travel only so far each day. A person walking beneath the sun could only continue for a certain amount of time. Travel required planning. Water had to be carried. Resting places had to be known. The desert demanded respect. Those who lived near it understood that the empty land was both beautiful and dangerous. It stretched endlessly beneath the sky, silent and unchanged. At the edge of the desert, people often looked toward the horizon and saw a world completely different from their own. The green fields ended. The sand began. The contrast was a constant reminder of how precious the Nile truly was. Without the river, there would be no villages, no farms, no markets, no daily life. Everything returned to the water. Even religious practices were connected to the natural world around them. The river, the sun, and the changing seasons influenced how people understood existence. For ordinary families, belief was woven into everyday moments. A small prayer before a journey. A respectful gesture during a ceremony. A hope for protection during illness. Faith existed alongside work. A farmer could pray for a good harvest while still repairing irrigation channels with his own hands. A fisherman could ask for safety while still checking his nets carefully. People trusted both their traditions and their own efforts. As the day grew hotter, the rhythm slowed. The bright Egyptian sun covered everything. The stones became warm. The roads became dusty. The fields shimmered. The animals searched for shade. Inside the homes, families waited through the hottest hours. The thick walls provided some relief. Small rooms remained darker and cooler. Water jars offered refreshment. Children rested. Older people conserved their energy. Women continued quieter tasks indoors. The middle of the day was a time when even the strongest workers needed patience. The heat reminded everyone that humans were part of nature, not separate from it. The environment shaped every decision. The time people worked. The clothes they wore. The houses they built. The food they prepared. The tools they created. Everything came from understanding the world around them. When the afternoon finally began to soften, activity returned. The fields became busy again. The roads filled with footsteps. The markets grew louder. The river reflected the changing light. People returned to their tasks until the sun began its slow descent. Evening was always a special transition. The hardest part of the day was finished. The air became gentler. The colors of the landscape changed. The golden light touched the walls of homes and made ordinary places appear peaceful. Workers walked home carrying the evidence of their labor. Dust on their clothing. Tiredness in their movements. Tools in their hands. They returned not to grand halls or impressive rooms, but to simple homes filled with familiar voices. A child waiting at the doorway. A meal being prepared. A lamp already glowing. These were the comforts that mattered. Inside the homes, the day was remembered through conversation. A father spoke about the fields. A mother spoke about household tasks. Children spoke about small discoveries. An elderly relative listened quietly, recognizing the same patterns that had existed throughout their own lifetime. The evening air moved gently across the rooftops. The village became calm. The stars appeared one by one. The Nile reflected the darkness above. And once again, the people of ancient Egypt prepared for sleep. Their lives were not filled with constant change. They were filled with connection. Connection to the land. Connection to the river. Connection to family. Connection to the generations before them. The world around them remained steady, and they remained steady with it. Tomorrow would bring another sunrise. Another morning beside the Nile. Another day of familiar work. Another evening beneath the stars. And within that endless cycle, ordinary people found their own quiet kind of peace. The night settled gently over the Egyptian valley once again. The warmth of the day slowly disappeared from the mud-brick walls, and the cool desert air returned. Above the rooftops, the stars stretched across the dark sky like countless small lamps placed carefully by an unseen hand. Along the Nile, the world became quieter. The fields rested. The workshops became empty. The markets closed. The roads that had carried thousands of footsteps during the day became still. Yet even in the deepest hours of darkness, life continued in small ways. A mother adjusted a sleeping child's blanket. A fisherman checked the condition of his boat before the morning. A guard walked slowly through a quiet settlement. A baker prepared grain for the next day's bread. The rhythm of Egypt never truly stopped. It only became softer. For many people, the night was the only time when the weight of the day could fully disappear. After hours beneath the sun, after carrying water, shaping stone, planting crops, or preparing food, the darkness offered a gentle pause. Sleep was not always comfortable. Many people rested on simple woven mats. Some used small wooden headrests. Families often slept close together because homes were limited in space and because closeness offered warmth and security. The sounds of the household slowly faded. A child's breathing became steady. An old person turned quietly on their sleeping mat. A lamp burned lower and lower until the room was filled only with moonlight. Outside, the Nile continued its slow movement. The river had watched countless generations live beside it. It had carried fishermen, merchants, farmers, and travelers. It had reflected the faces of children who would grow old beside its waters. The people who lived near it understood that their own lives were brief compared to the river's endless journey. But they also understood that their daily actions mattered. Every field they planted, every loaf they baked, every tool they repaired, every child they taught. These small things created the life of Egypt. When morning returned, the cycle began again. In the farming villages, the first workers stepped outside before the heat arrived. Their bodies carried memories of yesterday's labor, but their hands knew what to do. The farmer's relationship with his tools was deeply familiar. A wooden hoe was not just an object. It was something shaped by another person's hands. It had been repaired many times. It carried marks from years of use. A fisherman's net held the same kind of history. Each repair represented another day of survival. Each knot carried the memory of careful work. In ancient Egypt, objects often carried stories because people kept them for so long. A broken item was not immediately replaced. It was fixed. A damaged basket was woven again. A cracked container was repaired. A worn piece of clothing was patched. People lived with what they had. This created a close relationship between humans and the things around them. Nothing was quickly forgotten. Nothing was easily discarded. The same patience appeared in farming. A farmer did not plant seeds and immediately expect a harvest. He understood waiting. He understood that the earth worked according to its own rhythm. The seed disappeared beneath the soil before it ever became something visible. Days passed. The sun warmed the ground. The water reached the roots. Slowly, life appeared. This process was familiar to every generation. The young learned it from the old. The old remembered it from those before them. The fields became a place where the past and future met. As the morning continued, children moved through the village learning the world around them. Childhood in ancient Egypt was not separate from adult life. Children watched everything. They learned by being present. A boy carrying a small basket beside his father was already beginning his education as a farmer. A girl helping prepare bread was learning skills that would support her future household. A child sitting near a craftsman's workshop was absorbing knowledge without realizing it. Learning happened everywhere. At home. In fields. Beside rivers. Inside workshops. Knowledge was not always something written down. Often, it was something practiced. A person learned by doing. By repeating. By making mistakes. By trying again. This was especially true for craftspeople. A young worker might spend years completing simple tasks before being trusted with more difficult work. A beginner potter might only prepare clay at first. A beginner carpenter might only carry materials. A beginner builder might only assist others. Slowly, skill developed. The passage of time itself became a teacher. In the workshops, the sounds of labor returned. The turning of pottery wheels. The scraping of tools. The movement of woven threads. The quiet conversations between workers. Each workshop had its own atmosphere. The potter worked surrounded by clay and sunlight. The carpenter worked among wood shavings. The weaver worked among hanging threads. The stone worker worked among dust and heavy materials. Every occupation created its own small world. Yet all of them shared the same rhythm. Patient effort. Careful attention. Repeated movement. Across Egypt, people spent their days creating the objects that allowed society to function. The farmer provided food. The fisherman provided fish. The potter provided containers. The weaver provided clothing. The builder provided structures. The scribe preserved information. The merchant connected communities. Each person depended on others. A loaf of bread represented many different kinds of work. The farmer who grew grain. The worker who harvested it. The person who carried it. The woman who ground it. The baker who shaped it. The family who shared it. A simple meal contained the effort of many hands. This understanding created a strong sense of connection between people. Life was difficult, but it was not lived alone. Communities survived because people depended upon one another. During difficult seasons, this dependence became even more important. A poor harvest affected everyone. A flood damaged many homes. An illness could spread through an entire village. In these moments, neighbors became essential. People helped repair walls. They shared food. They cared for the sick. They supported families who had lost someone. The strength of a village was measured not only by its buildings or wealth, but by the relationships between its people. In the afternoon, when the heat pressed heavily upon the valley, many workers slowed their pace. The Egyptian sun demanded respect. No one could ignore it. Even the strongest laborers understood the need for rest. A person who worked without caution could become weak or sick. The shade of a palm tree became a valuable place. A wall could become a place of relief. A cool room inside a home could feel like protection from the entire world outside. During these hours, people often found moments of quiet reflection. A farmer might sit and look across the fields. A fisherman might watch the movement of water. A craftsman might examine his tools. These were small moments, but they were part of daily existence. Ancient Egyptians did not live surrounded by constant noise and movement. Much of life contained waiting. Waiting for crops to grow. Waiting for the river to rise. Waiting for the heat to fade. Waiting for the evening. Waiting was not seen as wasted time. It was simply part of the natural rhythm of things. As evening approached, the valley transformed once again. The harsh brightness softened. The shadows grew longer. The air became easier to breathe. Workers began returning home. The same roads filled with tired footsteps. The same doors opened. The same families gathered. The same lamps were lit. The day slowly became memory. For a moment, the people of Egypt could forget the weight of tomorrow. They could sit beneath the stars. They could share food. They could listen to the river. They could rest. The world around them was old, but it was also familiar. The same moon had risen above their ancestors. The same river had carried their parents. The same stars had watched generations grow and disappear. There was comfort in belonging to something so much larger than oneself. A single person's life was short. But the traditions, habits, and rhythms they followed continued. A child learning to grind grain was connected to every child who had done the same before. A fisherman repairing his net was connected to every fisherman who had sat beside the river before him. A farmer planting seeds was connected to every farmer who had trusted the earth before him. The daily life of Egypt was a long chain of ordinary moments. Most of those moments were never recorded. Most names were forgotten. Most voices disappeared. But the rhythm remained. And beneath the quiet Egyptian night, as the Nile flowed peacefully beside sleeping villages, the people rested knowing that when morning arrived, life would continue exactly as it always had. The ovens would warm. The fields would call. The river would move. And another day would begin in the ancient land where time seemed to flow as gently as the water beside them. The night returns once more to the quiet valley of the Nile. The villages have grown still. The last lamps burn softly inside mud-brick homes, their small flames moving gently with the evening air. The sounds of the day have faded away. The footsteps on dusty roads have disappeared. The workshops are silent. The fields rest beneath the darkness. Only the river continues its slow journey. The Nile moves quietly beneath the stars, just as it has for countless generations. Its waters pass beside the same lands where farmers once planted their seeds, where fishermen once guided their boats, where families once gathered beneath the evening sky. Long ago, ordinary people lived beside this river. They woke before sunrise. They carried water. They baked bread. They worked the fields. They shaped stone. They repaired tools. They cared for children. They comforted the sick. They rested after long days beneath the warm Egyptian sky. Their lives were not filled with constant change. They were built from small moments repeated again and again. A morning meal shared with family. A walk beside the river. A conversation beneath the stars. The sound of laughter from children playing near the homes. The feeling of cool air arriving after a day of heat. These simple moments were the true rhythm of ancient Egypt. The great temples and monuments remained behind as reminders of the civilization that created them. But beneath those enormous stones were millions of quiet lives. People whose names were never carved into walls. People whose stories were never written on papyrus. Yet they were there. They were the hands that planted the fields. The hands that shaped the clay. The hands that pulled the boats along the river. The hands that prepared food at the end of the day. They built their world slowly, one ordinary action at a time. A child watching a parent work. A neighbor helping another family. An elder sharing memories. A worker returning home beneath the orange light of sunset. These moments disappeared quietly, but they mattered. Because history was not only made by kings and rulers. It was also made inside small homes. Beside cooking fires. Along riverbanks. Across fields of grain. Within the peaceful routines of people who simply lived their lives. As the stars shine above the Nile, the ancient valley becomes quiet once again. The same wind moves across the desert. The same river continues flowing. The same night covers the land. The voices of the past may have faded, but the feeling of their lives remains. The warmth of the homes. The patience of the workers. The care of families. The gentle rhythm of days that followed one another without hurry. Ancient Egypt was a world of repetition, but within that repetition was a quiet beauty. There was comfort in knowing what tomorrow would bring. There was peace in familiar paths. There was meaning in simple tasks. There was connection between one generation and the next. And now, as the night grows deeper, the valley rests. The fishermen have returned home. The farmers have finished their work. The children are sleeping. The lamps have become small points of light against the darkness. The Nile continues to whisper beside the silent villages. Carrying memories. Carrying stories. Carrying the echoes of a world that once lived beneath the same stars. So let the ancient river continue its journey. Let the desert wind move softly across the land. Let the old stone walls stand quietly beneath the moon. And let the people of ancient Egypt rest peacefully in the pages of history, remembered not only for what they built, but for how they lived. Slowly. Patiently. Together. The night settles over the Nile. The stars remain above. And the ancient world gently fades into silence.